My wife and I had just gotten our marriage certificate when she suddenly made a strange request. She asked me to wait 5 years before we could be together. Although I was filled with doubt, I saw the marriage certificate in my hand and agreed to her request. However, one day, my wife's neighbor came to find me claiming she had seen my wife bringing back a strange humanoid doll every night, suspecting she had some unknown fetish. I immediately retorted that my wife wasn't like that, but the neighbor dragged me to the yard and told me to see for myself. It wasn't until I saw my wife bringing the humanoid doll into the house and then heard strange sounds from inside that I suddenly realized the neighbor might be telling the truth. At that moment, the neighbor added fuel to the fire, saying I had waited 5 years to remain chaste for my wife, but now she was having fun with a doll. I listened to the neighbor's provocations and felt my heart was in turmoil. I rushed forward and demanded to know what my wife was doing inside. Why, after 5 years, had she never let me into her room? Seeing my relentless questioning, my wife had no choice but to explain that she was making a piece of clothing and planned to wear it for me on our wedding night. In 3 days after hearing this, I realized the humanoid dolls were models my wife needed for designing clothes, but I was still puzzled. What kind of clothing would take 5 years to make? Then, to comfort me, my wife immediately promised that in 3 days, she would let me into the room and fulfill our marital duties. Seeing the sincerity in her eyes, I stopped doubting her, thinking that if I just waited 3 more days when the 5-year period was up, I would naturally know what my wife had been doing. However, at that time, I had no idea that the neighbor had secretly been in love with me. Seeing how much I trusted my wife and how our relationship still seemed solid, the neighbor was determined to tear us apart. So the next day, she brought me to my wife's house again. I saw a bunch of fitness coaches getting out of a van in the yard. They followed my wife into the house. Didn't want to believe my wife would betray me, so I quietly went to the yard hoping to catch my wife off guard. But to my surprise, she came out of the door on her own. Seeing my wife like this, I angrily questioned her. Why had she kept me away from her room for 5 years, but now was casually letting a bunch of men into the house? Where had our relationship gone? But my wife was exhausted at that moment and told me to stop bothering her, that she was really tired, but I was blinded by anger and insisted on going into my wife's room to check. My wife desperately tried to stop me, begging me to believe her and give her 2 more days to explain everything. But the neighbor was constantly stirring the pot, saying that 2 days was enough for my wife to destroy all the evidence and that by then, I wouldn't be able to do anything. Hearing this, I immediately tried to push the door open. My wife desperately tried to stop me and urgently said everything she was doing was for our future, but the neighbor kept demeaning my wife, telling me not to believe her lies and reminding me of all the suffering I had endured for 5 years for her, that I shouldn't let myself be fooled. In the end, the neighbor then shoved my wife away and dragged me into the house. However, there was no one inside, only strange sounds came from the bedroom. I quickly pushed my wife aside and ran toward the door where the sound was coming from. My wife immediately stepped in front of me and looked at me with grievance, asking if I didn't trust her at all, but I could no longer tolerate it. I shoved her to the ground and rushed toward the door that would reveal the truth. But when I opened the door, I was completely stunned.